Psychotechnologies Live. Welcome to a very special episode of Psychotechnologies Live. Today we have a guest, Jon Twigge. Jon Twigge has been around in the spiritual community for, well, let's not date him, but for a while. And he's got some fantastic stories that he wants to share with us, some crazy experiences that he's had, people he's met. He's got some thoughts on that, and then a direction on where he wants to go, and some stuff that he's working on. So, Jon, how's it going?
Hello. Very nice to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. I'm not sure I quite fit that introduction, but I'll do my best.
Maybe we should start with like a timeline, like what year maybe, and how old were you when you first flipped into consciousness or spirituality? Like
how did you even,
what's the beginning?
The first thing I'd say is that when you say I've been part of this community, I've kind of been on the edge, half or mainly living in the normal world, but with a background fascination for this kind of stuff. So, and at times I've even thought I was born with an interest in it. I remember being, I don't know, very young, 10 or 12, watching a program about Buddhism on the television. And I still remember it was really fascinating that this program was about the search for a Buddhist monk, one of the ones that they go and look for them when they're 3 or 5 years, something like that, after the previous reincarnation died, and they go and identify them. And it's not so much the story of finding them. They have the questions they ask them to see if they remember their past life. But the bit that really struck me was at the end of the program, they showed this 5-year-old monk who was now becoming a monk again, sitting for hours. It didn't show the whole thing, obviously. It was a summary, but they described some kind of ceremony where this 5-year-old sat for hours blessing monks, one after another, with such serenity that there's something to this. This is not normal for a 5-year-old. And I've always been really curious that what is this? What is consciousness? Why does it feel like I'm inside my head? That seems strange. I don't know why it seemed strange, but it still kind of does. If you take that into psychology or whatever, they talk about this hard problem of consciousness, and some people just ignore it and say no, that it's the brain, we just don't know how it works yet. But I've not heard of anybody trying that can actually make an explanation as to how consciousness is related to the brain, how this experience thing is in any way related to physical matter. So there's this separation apparently between what appears to be physical and the way that we experience life. And I've got a friend that talks about this and says it's actually much more plausible that it's consciousness that is at the root of everything, and all this physical stuff is just an experience within it of some sort. So it's actually the consciousness that's prior to the physical matter.
So I've heard this, that, I experientially usually habitually sit in the world that is the atoms world. There's a lot of atoms. I look at the wall in front of me, I'm like, that's made of atoms, that's made of atoms. I'm like, the foundation, the base of my experience is the atom world. And more recently, obviously, I've been pointed to the consciousness first, which is that as I sit here and look out to the world, I kind of have consciousness, and then later I learned that the science says that it's all made out of atoms, but actually, if we put the foundation of reality is consciousness, and then on top of it we described it as atoms, that's very different to then if the atoms are at the bottom and the consciousness is sitting within that. Like, what is the shape of the foundational shape of the field of play? And what would be different if it was the case that it was the other one?
And I've heard a few people say that babies don't really have this concept of these physical atoms, of course. They're just in experience. And it takes a few years for them to start recognizing these abstract ideas that there's a physical world and to recognize their own reflection and to go through that process of seeing it from that way. But of course, once you've picked up that you're supposed to answer to your name and you're a thing in the world, it's one of those things that can flip. But once it has, it's very hard to see it back from the other view again, because we and language very much reinforces this all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we create these models or these like lesser realities, and so that we can function, and then we get caught up in them and live them, and then we need to like snap back to reality and realize, oh, this is all just things that we're talking about. Like, you know,
I mean,
like,
I used to have this. At one point, I would go for a run in the morning, and usually when I run through the world. Like the park is a stationary object, and I walk around the park, like I walk in it. But then there's a frame shift where I could make myself stationary and have the world like fly towards me, kind of like video game style, and that's confusing. And then I could switch back and forth, and that was like quite confusing. Like I'm the stationary reality, and the earth rotates around me as I run, as I flail my legs, but like the center of my chest is the stationary point. Very confusing, like perspective shift.
Yeah, I could describe something very similar from recent quotes experience of learning more and more about non-duality, but not so much that the world is shifting, but this idea that there's a me looking at the world. It's like it collapses all into one, and there's just experience, and it's hard to separate me from. So what appears to be inside me and what was assumed to be outside, there's no quality of separation between them at all. It's all just experience of some sort. And then, of course, the next question is who is experiencing that? And I can't find that. There's just this experience. Yeah, I remember being a student. So we're talking 35 years ago or so, and thinking about this a lot. And it's like, what is consciousness? And I decided for myself, though, all that time ago, that either there must be a God of some sort that was investing consciousness into the world in some way, without getting involved in particular religions or anything, but there must have been some mechanism for making consciousness arrive in a world of some sort, or consciousness was inherent in everything. So this was kind of still coming from a physical perspective, but physical stuff automatically had consciousness in some sense, and it was just a matter of density, that a brain brought enough complexity together. So, and I remember thinking at the time, well, the TV is conscious, but it's just at a very simple level. The brain has just got enough of it that it starts to become self-aware. And then I thought afterwards a little while, or maybe both. Maybe there was a God, and maybe everything is consciousnly. So that was an early thought.
As enlightened as a rock.
Yeah. Yes.
Sort of holds that for me. Like, well, rocks also possibly have the atoms that could support consciousness if they were reorganized into a brain.
Yes. Yes. Well, everything does in that sense. Well, I'm not saying it does. That was the thought I was having at the time. That
well, that's what it seems
matter
like.
Matter was kind of related to consciousness at some deep level, but I couldn't see why a brain should suddenly have consciousness differently to anything else. Fascinating stuff. And even now, but I think that was still coming from the point of view that there was this physical thing that was related to consciousness, or there was some kind of magical godlike thing. And I think that's still very dualistic. I hadn't even come across non-duality until much, much later. Yeah, so there was always these asking questions all those years ago. Started reading all sorts of things, and randomly found an advert in a magazine somewhere for the Rosicrucians, which was
what are the Rosicrucians? Tell us about those.
Well, I'd have to say that it's a long time ago, and I never got massively into it. I started getting interested, and they had mail order courses that you could send off for, and it was all got ancient Egyptian
Do you
symbols
remember
on
like a
it.
year or like around when was this?
I must have started when I was about 16, when I sent off for this course, and started getting these magazines every month or so. And I remember the first exercise. I don't know how I remember it because I've not thought about it for 30 years. But that's another thing that's really weird. Our brains do to us. How does that work? The physics of how a brain brings back memories is just incredible. But anyway, that's another story. The first exercise was to light a candle and to just look at the flame and to notice the nature of it.
He's doing some early casino practice.
Yeah, I mean, this didn't have any other context for me other than that I was doing these exercises, and there was nobody where I lived. As a student, this is how, partly, as I say, I was always on the edge of this kind of stuff, and being very quiet and introvert. That I was really looking forward to going to Manchester. Well, it was a separate bit, Manchester University in England. It was a separate bit called UMIST, which was more scientific, because they had a meeting in Manchester. But me being a typical big picture, not particularly conscientious for details, left it a bit late to go on the bus and arrived without much time to spare, couldn't find the building, and then was too shy to go in late. So I never actually got to any of their meetings. So all I ever did was read these little magazines, do a few of their exercises. And I think that was the beginning of my touching lots of different things. It must have not been much later when I went to something called subud, which was an Indonesian practice that I won't say much about because you're not supposed to really say much about it, but that they did some exercises, and if they liked you after a few weeks, they let you into their little exercises they do. And I think it was the thing was, it was an Indonesian guy that probably had some spiritual experience, interpreted it, and this is what I think it happens to most religions, is that somebody has some kind of deep experience, it gets interpreted in the culture of the time, because it has to be represented to the people in that culture and that time, and then somebody writes it all down in a book. And then it stops becoming a living experience that first person had, and it becomes something that gets tied to that culture and doesn't evolve. So yes, tried lots of different things. I remember
I have a friend, Romeo, who says that if Buddhism didn't already exist for the West, it would have had to have been invented for the West. The same something, the like concrete journey making self path would have to have been invented if someone hadn't already written it down a couple thousand years ago, and if it didn't survive.
Yes, because it was very much as if the West was waiting for it, wasn't it, for the Buddhist teachers to come across.
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of the Buddhist teachers, go on.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what we do at the channel of Psychotechnologies is trying to do that thing that you said exactly, where we're having these experiences and we're trying to relate them in the language of our time. And how do we generate these experiences and the source of them? And so you're like, you've been around for a while, and like you've seen a lot of these different things happening and been on the edges and listened to read the material. I know, spoiler, like there's some other things, also experiences that you've had and people you've interacted with. And for me, that's very alive and very interesting. Like as someone who's gone through some of the stuff, like what, the pitfalls and what good things have happened, like what has been generated for you that has altered your life or improved your life, or also just like crazy experiences.
Yeah.
Wildest experience.
Yeah, I hate doing like wildest or craziest, but like some of the ones that you want to share. Like what happened after the rosettes?
Rosicrucians, yeah.
After
Rosicrucians.
subud.
I did try
Yes,
a little bit of a time in local politics as well, much later. So we did touch on rosettes, but that's not part of this story. So yeah, I can't. Yes, what happened was I got a job about 50 or 60 miles from where I was living. I was traveling every day for a while, but we were doing some work and we needed some help with something, and a consultant came in, and we seemed to resonate, and we were talking a lot. And after a while, he started to tell me about, because I was always asking questions, and he seemed to know quite a lot. Eventually, he said, I don't normally tell anybody about this. I learned lots of years ago not to talk about it, but I'm interested in this guru called Adidar. And if you want to, you could read a book. And I was fascinated by all this stuff. So I did. I read a couple of these books. Adidar is a really fascinating character. Going all the way from, for example, Ken Wilber, but as you say, Ken Wilber recommends lots of things, but Ken Wilber saying that Adidar was a great realized teacher, to other people that had had difficult experiences with this and talked about it as a cult. But as I say, I used to do things from the edge. And of course, that was in the US, and he'd moved, the guru Adidar had moved to Hawaii and Fiji even. So I was very much at a distance through a friend that was actually a software guy like me. And he was quite intellectual about it. Many of the Adidar people were far more devotional, fall in love with the guru even. So I actually met the right person for me to introduce me to it, because it's much more related, much more of a closer way to the way I would look at things. He'd talk about Buddhism and Nirvana and Samsara are the same thing. And the 4 fundamental questions he talked about in one of the books. Do you know what anything is? Questions like that. Are you the one that is living you now? Was one of those 4 fundamental questions. Are you actually an individual living, or are you just an observer of what's happening? And this really resonated for me. It's like, this makes a lot of sense, because I can really identify with, I'm not doing this. It does appear to be happening in some sense, even though at that point I wasn't even thinking about the nature of what I am, but it very much seemed that there was a me watching this all happening, as opposed to, even as I'm talking now, it appears as if the words are coming out. If I stop and look, it doesn't feel as if I'm doing them. Now, a scientist might just say, well, that's just your subconscious knows how to say words, and it translates them and does all those things, but that's not what it feels like. It feels as if they're just happening, and all this experience is just happening. So, nice. Yeah. So I read 3 or 4 of these books, I think. His autobiography was called The Knee of Listening. Oddly enough, I eventually passed that to my brother as well, who my brother, I said at the start that I'd kind of got 2 lives. I went through school, university, college, whatever you want to call it, and just floated through that and found it relatively easy. So I didn't worry about it too much. My brother had done the opposite and struggled at school and not followed that path, and kind of gone in a very different path and stepped out of that normal path and wasn't sure what he was doing with his life. So a bit later, I gave that book, The Knee of Listening, to him to read. And he told me later he'd never read a book in his life, not a whole one. He'd started books, but he read that 400-page book and then moved down to their ashram in the south of England, much to the concern of relatives, shall we say, parents, etc. But on the other hand, yeah, not quite sure whether he maybe needed it, or he needed some path. So, and he's actually been, just in the last few days, he's still following Adidar, or the movement, and he's been over at their ashram in Holland, I think, just last week.
Wow.
So yeah, fascinating stuff. So I read a couple of books, talked to my friend about this a lot. he was quite a bit older. We lost him a few years ago now, but which was sad. But eventually it's like, but I want to go and see these people myself. So this is just a little story that somebody I was with at the time, and my mum and her partner, we went to, we were having a day out at the seaside. Now, this was a couple of hours drive to get there. And that's main roads. It's quite good travel. And I looked at the map, and their ashram was in a place in south east England called Norwich. And I was up in the Midlands, in the middle of the country. So that was about 2 hours to the seaside place that we'd been before. It was a nice drive out for the day. And I looked at the map and thought, this Norwich place is not far from where we're going at the seaside. And it didn't look very far on the map. But what I hadn't taken into account that was the roads, if you weren't following the main arteries, were not very good. And I said, oh, we'll just nip to this place when we're finished. And it took us over an hour to find it, and it was already getting late. And we went to the ashram that actually bought between them, between all of the students, and there must have been about 30 of them living there. But they'd bought this really big old hall. So I was in the car, and the others not at all sure what I'm taking them to. On a Sunday evening, getting very late at night. I think it must have been 9, 10 o'clock at night, and we've got to drive home yet after this. They start to get panicking, wondering, is this a cult, and who's bought this great big house, and where do they get all the money from? They're actually struggling to pay the rent, as many communities, or the mortgage between them, as many communities do. But this was one of those strange situations where I then knocked on the door on 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening, and eventually somebody answered the door. And I think they thought I was more weird than they were, turning up in the middle of nowhere that time of night on a Sunday night. But after a minute or two, they realized I was serious and wanted to say hello for a few minutes. And they led me down to their little bookshop. And I bought my own copies of a couple of the books that I hadn't read yet. This was fascinating for me. I mean, there's lots of interesting books to look at, all sorts of things. I could have stayed there hours. Totally forgot I'd got other people in the car outside. So a little bit later, I don't know if it was only half an hour or 3/4 of an hour, but of course they're all ready for home. There was a knock on the door. Where are you? Have you been kidnapped? All that kind of stuff. So it's like, oh yeah, okay, I better go. And so off I went, and I was driving. So we must have got home 11 o'clock, midnight, something like that. So I'd been driving for about 6 hours altogether through the day. And one of the 2 books that I picked up had got a picture of the guru on the front cover walking out into the sea. And then on the back cover, that I'd just picked up in the bookshop while I was talking to them, on the back cover, he was walking back out of the sea to you. I was really tired by the time we'd done, went to bed, getting really late, but I was overtired. I don't know if we used to say that about children, that you were too exhausted, mind racing and whatever else. And still thinking about what had happened. And I remember that I was laying there in bed, couldn't sleep, everything racing through my mind. And then suddenly I remembered that picture of this guru walking back out of the sea. He was just got little tiny swimming trunks on, all tanned from living in Fiji or wherever he was. And suddenly it was as if I fell into the picture. Like it literally felt that I'd fallen into it, sucked into a hole, black hole or whatever. And then the next thing, if I can talk about time, which I'm not sure I can, it felt as if my heart lit up in some sense, some energetic sense. The only way I could even think about this was Adidar said at one point about himself, and I just associate it with him, but I have no idea whether it's relevant or not. But he said that in most people, every single cell in our body, they're like little magnets, but they all point in random directions. So the sum total force doesn't add up to much. But he said in him, they all point in the same direction and become this incredible force. almost as if you're unleashing some nuclear power or something.
Mhm.
So I have no idea if that's relevant or not, but I felt this energy in somewhere around my heart, but it actually expanded and grew. And I literally felt this energy filling me up. And then not only did it reach eventually the tips of my fingers and my toes and my head, it kept going almost, it felt as if it was to infinity. It's like this energy or something that was in me became everything, and I was kind of associated with it. And then I blacked out in some sense. I wasn't there. And I don't know how long later it was. I woke up a few minutes later, woke up, came back to whatever you described it as, and my heart felt as if it was jumping out of my chest. And I was dripping in sweat, absolutely dripping in sweat. And something had shifted. Not much, or almost nothing, but something had happened. And I said to friends afterwards, a few days, it actually felt as if the world was brighter in some sense. Literally, as I was walking around, everything looked brighter in some way. I don't know how, but it faded. And a quote from the Adidar said, in that first moment, I give you everything, but then then it's up to you. It's like he shows you things or something, but then you've got to do some work. And I spent lots of years like, but how do you get back to that? And the story for me was, it must have been 15 years later before I kind of realized, although I can't really say knew in any sense, but felt or realized that searching to grab and hold on to something and find that experience again is actually part of the problem. So you've got to let go. Another book that I read was a French philosopher, I think. Completely forgotten it now, but he had a little diagram that was meant to represent enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it. And it was 2 lines and an arrow to the bottom one. And he described it as, you can follow this journey to that first line. You can do various practices, but they'll only take you to the bottom line of those 2. And you can't get across the gap. You can't do that. But he said, sometimes it's as if you fall across or you're pulled from the other side. And it felt after quite a lot of years, I realized that I had to let go. But I didn't know how to get to the other side, and still don't, even though there's been moments of thinking maybe. But yeah, it's almost as if, there's a something that we can't do. It has to happen. Some people might call it grace or letting go.
Let me see if I can reflect some of what's going on for you. So like what I'm hearing from you is like you're this like spiritual journeyer or something, like from like the stories where you go around to try out different places and see what's out there.
Can I say though that this was very much in the background and very part-time and very lazy. So I wouldn't like to describe myself as somebody that was spiritual and searching, and I was busy having a job and doing all the ordinary things.
You're just a normal guy with a hobby.
I was always a bit odd, but yes, normal in that sense. Yeah.
I think everyone's a bit odd.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess so you're just a regular guy doing regular things, and there's this part of your life that I guess the people around you have trouble relating to. Or like the people like in the car wouldn't come in. Like, to me, that would be, if I was with someone doing that journey, I would be like, I'm not staying in the car. Like I'm going to check out this weird house, Yeah.
But this had always been in the background for me, so I'd never really. Well, nobody else showed any interest, and even now, there's very, very few people to talk to about non-duality. If you start asking somebody, well, are you really what you think you are? Many people will just say, well, yeah. If you ask somebody, well, what are you? They say, well, this is me here. And you start saying,
Right.
are you sure? There's a lot of
Like,
people, if you push
they're
that,
just-
they start getting
they're-
quite aggressive, saying, what are you talking about? This is crazy. Yeah. So
They're just like
as my
trying to get
friend,
out of the.
yeah,
Sorry.
as my friend that introduced me to it said, he stopped talking about it because for most people, the conversation just doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do struggle with that a lot as well. Because like for me, I'm just like, okay, like what do you like? Let's just talk about our experiences, and then everything else will kind of just start to sort itself out. But I think people do have this sort of pushback against this. I don't even know what it is that we're doing. I just call it psychotech because I like that word. But it's like this like life thing, this the place where experience, I think, arises from, sort of where we like to hang out. And then you get people like Adida. So you introduced me to Adida. I watched a video of him talking, and it was a very interesting experience. I sort of like lost track of what he was saying, and I was just feeling like this. He's talking about like the space around me became my consciousness, which was like incredibly interesting. And I imagine being there, you're probably like, I'm not surprised that there's these ashrams and people following it and people going on with it. It's like, it does just like suck you in, and you lose yourself, which is interesting because it's like in normal world, let's say losing yourself is considered sort of bad or negative or dangerous. And in our world, like this is the thing that we're after. Like this is the part of the reason, one of the big things that we're trying to achieve through meditation or practice or retreats or.
Yeah, this reminded me of things I've not thought about for a long time. That he talked about how the gopis, were they the girls that followed Krishna, fell in love with him. It's very much back to yoga, literally falling in love with the guru, or falling in God, falling in love with God or consciousness or whatever you want to call it in those terms, through the guru. And what would happen is this is just a way of basically everything else would fall away, because your ordinary life would fall away. If these girls were married or whatever, they'd just forget that ordinary life and literally follow the guru. And that, through some kind of grace, could give some kind of gift or whatever you might want to call it. But Adidar also talked about, but that's the simplest form of, I mixed the words up. I'm just trying to, is that the right word, back to yoga? Yes, and then he talked about another one, which was karma yoga, which would be to do the work, to do the practice, to get involved in these things with it. And it might suit different people, but that would be a way of giving or letting go of ordinary life by being engaged in the practice. But he said the fastest way to do it would be, now I have forgotten the word for this because we're talking lots of years ago, but through Raja yoga, I think, which would be to understand the process and to actually understand yourself, which makes me think more of a Buddhist practice of recognizing the nature of everything directly, which would be better for some people. So we talked about these different paths of finding what you might call enlightenment, I guess, depending how it was going. So that was really fascinating. So I got very much into this, went to a few events, and eventually thought, I've got to see him. So there I was most of the time having an ordinary life and working, writing software and that kind of stuff, and then going back to a family.
A year? Like what year was it approximately? Well, how many years ago as well?
That's going to be around 30 years ago, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, up to 30 years ago, something like that. And I actually followed it for quite a while, a few years, but at a distance.
You didn't join the compound and give up all your possessions. You kind of stayed at distance.
No, but I did a little bit. What they did is, while I was there, they introduced what I think they call this third congregation. The idea being for people that were in the world, they recognized that not everybody wanted to give up a job and a life. They've got families and mortgages and various different things. So this was a way of entering the practice formally and not giving them all of your possessions, but it did involve giving them some money. Which, having got a new mortgage and things, I wasn't willing to give them what they're asking for it, whatever it was, 10% of what you earned and all that. It just wasn't practical. I might have done if I'd had lots of spare money, because I was very much into it, but I feel a bit bad even saying that now, because people will be saying, oh, it's really gullible, you shouldn't do these kind of things. Of course, I mean, this was often the way that people did it years ago, many years ago, wasn't it? That lots of people would tithe to religion and the church or whatever it might be. It's just we've forgotten about that kind of stuff in the West, and we've got a very
there's still some of that stuff still exists. Like Christianity does this, and Judaism is original, I think, for this, and even effective altruism, which is like, I guess, like the new secular religion that's sort of emerging.
Try to say dangerous things.
That's a very
altruism recognizes itself as doing a tithing in the religious
they do
tithing.
Yeah, that's like I forgot what they call it, but
earning to give.
So there's earning to give, but then there's also like this other one of like the pledge. They have like the pledge of giving 10% to the effective charities. So
in many ways. Sorry, go on.
I think like these things are weird and offbeat and nobody does them, but everybody, like, they show up everywhere. Like they keep showing up and they're keep there. So as weird as they are, I think they are like, they always have that weirdness because one person's weirdness is another person's interest or you know, inspiration.
And there's a lot of business people as well, going back through all sorts of history of this kind of stuff. Jim Rohn, multi-level marketing, all sorts of different stuff of actually, if you give to charity and various good things, that's actually going to improve your life through various ways, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, and effective altruism, I learned a little bit about it because I thought this was really fascinating. But the basic premise for me, if I understood it right, was how can I use my life most effectively to bring as much good into the world?
Mm-hmm.
And the two streams of doing that were to do something specifically. So if you were good at biology or whatever it is, physiology, and could go and do some cancer research as a job, which might bring about directly a benefit for mankind, that was one way. But the other way was to recognize that your skills didn't line up with any particular one and go and make lots of money at some high-powered job, and to give some of that to those good causes to make a difference in that respect. So yeah, that's very much similar, I guess. But of course, it's all gone a bit wrong, hasn't it, recently, with the crypto and the... So not the whole of effective altruism, but obviously it's
all gone to shit. No, there was one guy who seemed to give a lot, and his company folded, and obviously, like most of the effective altruism movement is probably just a bit confused about, like, him giving a lot didn't actually touch the whole movement. There's a whole bunch of people who were just like, oh, there's a new guy giving, and then like suddenly
it's pretty significant.
He did try and give a lot of money.
The whole long-term movement, I think, is kind of seems to have stemmed from
a little bit confused or a little bit shaken. But the movement existed well and truly before this.
Yeah, the movement existed before him and it'll exist after him.
It's a real shame that it's got tarred with what he did, because the idea is a fundamentally good idea, I think, as it looked it to me. I suppose there's a danger that it was a bit academic, perhaps, but yeah.
I think that there's the parallels with them and with us and like with the Arida, where it's the thing that you're trying to do is a good thing, and also it's a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And like squaring that is really hard.
Yes, all these things are difficult and dangerous. But if we don't do anything, we can't achieve anything.
Right. That's a different kind of dangerous. Yeah.
Well, actually, I would say there's a lesson or something really valuable in not doing anything, which is that many people don't realize they can do nothing and rest, like recoup, recover. Like they're burning themselves through every kind of anxiety and mental health issue all at the same time. And if you just, carve yourself a little space to do nothing, then you can up resource in energy, and then like maybe you can do the same things but without the anxiety or the depression or the rush.
I always remember a book that I read lots of years ago, and I can't remember how long ago, called Stopping. And it was a fascinating book, but it was describing how we get so wrapped up in life, we forget to stop. And it's actually really good to stop. And he talked about micro stopping. I can't remember what terms he used, but very small stops that we would consciously stop every few minutes or every hour or two to have a break and just reset a little bit, rather than just plowing on all the time. And then he talked about how it's really important to have holidays every few months and all that kind of stuff, and make sure we get a real break. But he also talked about, in fact, I just realized maybe that's what I've been doing for the last couple of months. He also talked about how it's really good for everybody to have a major break once or twice in your life of a month or 3 months, when you really do stop and take the time out to evaluate. And there's a natural time to do that in our lives for many people. What's difficult, of course, is if you're wrapped up in a job that doesn't even think about those kind of things. Many people just don't get a chance to do that. Perhaps it's more accessible now with people swapping jobs more and more and much more freedom. But yeah, no, and that always struck me as really useful, to just stop and take some space to reevaluate and check. And when I'm writing software, it's really good. I mean, you might be going down a blind alley with the software and you're fighting to try and fix a bug or whatever else. It's a bit like, I think sometimes we wake up in the morning and we're fighting all day with an idea or a problem the day before, and we wake up and we know the answer. It's like there's things in the subconscious that work for us if we give them the space.
Yeah. I think relationships are somewhat like that too as well. Like I've been learning a lot about attachment styles, because I'm a new parent, and like, I see parents that often just on top and like just keep pushing, and it's like, just chill, like back off, give your kids some space, and then like, they're going to rest or they're going to do whatever, they're going to waste their time, and then they're going to go do the thing that they should be doing. And it's like that backing off gives like this like recuperation or re-equilibrium or something.
Yeah, I won't go into it now because we'll probably come back to it in a bit, but that really reminds me about how I ended up feeling it was really important that we understand attachment theory is one, and how we're related and what we've gone through, and obviously trauma and abuse and all that kind of stuff in the background. But then we've got personality types, we've got different values, and when you've got that big mix of a pot of parents that have gone through things, and then they're trying to do their best almost all the time for their children, there's a very much a temptation to push for them to become like we were, or the same again, because we know we managed to get through life and succeed to some extent, and we want to help our children to do the same. So it's a very fine balance. Perhaps that's a thing as well, that many people will say that often it's one parent that nurtures and it's the other one that pushes, and perhaps a balance like that. So yeah, I wouldn't like to get into parenting in any too much detail. Oh, it reminds me, I read a really good book called, lots of years ago, he was talking about how you're raising boys. That was a really good book, and it talked about how many parents, especially perhaps single mums if they're on their own, would always be telling the boys, don't fight, we don't do that. And he was talking about, and I did this with my two boys, they used to be wrestling all the time when I was the referee. And it's really good for them to go through that and realize what it means. And occasionally they have an accident, an elbow goes in the other one and catches them and they cry or whatever else. But to go through that process and know what it means is really useful, because they see what happens when that's not quite violence, but aggression and whatever goes wrong and what it means. I've often thought after that when they talk about violent video games desensitizing children, if you've been through that process of knowing how the real world works before you go and play these violent video games, you know what the context is and you know what the implications would be. But if you've not done that, I wonder perhaps if...
Sorry, out of touch.
Yeah, you lose touch. We've actually talked about this. We did one of these episodes. I think it was with Serene, where we talked about like boys like practicing violence from young ages, and like learning like scopes and boundaries, and like my 1-year-old is already like wants to wrestle with me. Sometimes he just smacks me in the face, and like that means it's go time and we're gonna fight.
Yeah, and of course you watch the natural world with all the animals and the tigers and all the lions, cubs,
the birds fight each other.
Yeah.
Even the birds fight each other. The cats eat the birds. Like.
Yeah, and it's just play fighting.
City environment.
Yeah.
And without that, you don't know how. I mean, the lions are learning the skills of physicalness. Obviously, they need to hunt. We as a species are in a strange position now, where we've still got this physiology with all these different chemicals, hormones, and everything flying around that we need to work with and understand. And then we go and sit in offices. And many people don't have the mechanisms for letting that flow and release it. So we can, because stress really is about when something goes wrong, when the tiger jumps out, the stress, the whatever happens within the body, it's fight or flight and all those kind of things. But in an office environment, it's constant stress, no way to let it go. And I mean, I think maybe the gym is often a way for many people to release that kind of stuff. But we need to be aware of all of those things. And I don't remember being at school and there's teaching us about all these kind of things. They teach these academic stuff.
They don't know that stuff. Like that's the thing. Everyone wants that to be part of education, but like if you want this stuff, like you got to go to like gym teachers back in the day probably knew that, but now it's like actual gyms. Like
I don't know about you, but when I went through school, gym was the lowest form of education.
Right.
I mean, maybe it was part of the nerd crowd, but we sort of, first of all, we avoided anything in gym class, and second of all, we looked down upon it.
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone did, but my little social bubble did. We were the nerds.
No, I was the opposite. I joined a wrestling club and did all sorts of stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, I went to religious school, so we didn't really have gym. But during breaks, we made Fight Club. Like I was like one of the like main organizers. So we just put some mat down and just fought each other.
And I was relatively big. I was always one of the biggest at school, and we used to play a game which a few years later got banned in schools because people got hurt sometimes, which is, I suppose, is the beginnings of, I don't want to label anything as woke, not woke, all these different kind of things, but society perhaps got too protective in some ways. But this game was called Bulldog, and in the gym you had 2 teams and you had to take turns to try and get to the other side. And there'd literally be an army of the other side trying to stop you getting there. So it was extremely physical at that age, but it was great fun. But it got banned from schools some years after that. So anything that was dangerous that people could get, but it's like children need to go outside and play and hurt themselves sometimes. And even if you do break something, most of the time you get better. To not do it, there's dangers about not doing that kind of stuff as well, I think.
Yeah, I think
I'm not an expert.
Yeah, do you think like not doing that stuff leads you to like try to find that in other ways later in life, where you're like, you do need this aggression, this back and forth, and because you don't know how to do it, as in you haven't had this experience, you can kind of like, I think of maybe a lot of passive aggressiveness and maybe social or political stuff, sort of like this is how it comes out.
I mean, I had a experience where I was practicing jujitsu and I got injured, and like I injured someone, and that's kind of like, this was 3 months in, and I was like, oh, this is time to stop because injuries are starting to happen. And I realized that part of the problem is that the mental will is stronger than the physical body. Or like I could will my body, like in a physical fight, right? I can say I'm gonna win mentally harder than my body was able to handle, as could the other person. And when our wills were unwilling to bend, something else had to bend, which was an arm or a leg or a joint. Like that's like there's a learning there. I should probably be learning where the limits of my mental will are, but unfortunately, if I do it physically against another body, one of them has to break.
Yeah,
obviously, like cutting it out entirely doesn't solve the problem of how we teach people that skill, but it definitely at least stops people from breaking their bodies against each other.
Yeah, and you want to learn that in a practice environment.
Right.
Like, because I 100% remember doing that in school, where like someone gets into lock or something, and then you're like, okay, like actually I probably could just let him break my arm and then win.
Right.
But,
maybe this is not such a great idea.
But like
there's this problem,
like
how exactly is the best way to teach people the limits of their will and the limits of human safety? We definitely can't do it by cutting out all risk, because that's not going to do it.
Yeah, I know. I think it is like, because like that like I have that thought process, and I'm like, oh, I know when I'm willing to sacrifice these things, but I was able to like practice in a safe environment, and so I'm like, this fight is not worth it because this fight doesn't mean anything aside from that we're keeping score. I think it's just a score, but like there is situations where I would do that, where I would sacrifice parts of my body.
I'm really curious about this because I was really physical. I would run a lot in the village. And even sometimes when other people were on bikes, often I preferred to run. Joined the wrestling club, liked playing bulldog, or that game I was talking about. But I don't recall it ever being aggressive in an unpleasant way. So there was this physicality about it all, and I obviously got used to it, but I don't remember, like you're saying, sacrifice and get injured, or I don't remember any of that. It was just fun. It was doing things. It was, I mean, occasionally something might happen, but what did happen once, which was the wrestling club, I was never champion. I was actually quite lucky. Is it lucky? I don't know. But because I was heavy for my age, we went to competitions, national competitions, as part of the club. It was actually one of the best clubs in the country I was going to. So there was really, really good trainers and things that had been extremely good many years before that. But when I always arrived in my weight, there'd only ever be 3 people in it, the same 3 people from around the country that were heavy enough to be in that. So I nearly always got a medal, came like 2nd or 3rd out of 3. So there it was, wrestling. I actually stopped wrestling eventually because I wanted to watch science fiction on television, and it was on the same night, and that idea of exploring the universe was more important than wrestling. But the one thing that I do remember now is that they tried an experiment and invited a judo club, and we had wrestling matches with them and judo matches with them as well. And I ended up in this judo match, and remember, I'm quite big at my age or whatever else, and I ended up doing judo with a girl at some point, and she immediately threw me over the top, spun me around, but I was too heavy, and she only half spun me. So instead of landing on my back, I landed on my shoulder, and it popped.
Oh.
So, or it half popped, which is worse apparently. and I ended up with my arm in one of those slings that they used to do years ago, where it's hanging like that they then later on say is actually really bad. But no, it had to be in a sling, and I had to do press-ups for months to make it strong again, and I've still got a bump on one of the shoulders. So yeah, that was my injury from all those things. But yeah, fascinating. I don't know why I'm remembering all these things. It's fascinating, isn't it? You suddenly start talking about these things and it all starts coming back. A book is coming back to me as well that was really important when I was a teenager, just randomly going in a different direction. And looking at your background there, Elliot, as well, in terms of the universe. This book was called Clairvoyant Reality.
Okay.
And I was 13, I think, when I read this. I was in a book club. One of these, you don't do these things anymore, do they? But you'd get a book once a month and choose one. But there was an alternative title for this, which, if you're looking for it, perhaps more likely to turn up, because it was called something like The Physicist, the Mystic, and something else. And it talked about how a physicist and mystics and clairvoyants, when they wrote things, if you took the context away of knowing who they were, they often were saying exactly the same things in terms of
the mystic and the physicist.
Yes. And they're all saying the same things. And then you've got physicists saying particles go backwards in time, and mystics saying that they can see things in the distance, far seeing, and all sorts of different things. And the words they use to describe their domains end up being very, very similar.
Well, part of the problem is also, I mean, I see this a lot in language. For example, the word evolution sort of came about in the biological domain. And then in terms of spiritual domain, we were looking for a word that describes the growing up of, in like, kind of like the way that the species evolve over time, the growing up of consciousness. And so we take the word evolution out of that one, we shove it into spirituality, and it makes complete sense when you realize we mean the growing uppy thing, but in the spirit. But then the biologists are really mad because we've stolen their words. And the same happens with the physics as well, right? The quantum this and the quantum as in like quantized as in like a gap with a jump. Well, you described one of those with the 2 lines earlier today. Like, okay, but if you take quantum out of physics and you shove it into spirituality, some people go, oh, that kind of like the leapy thing. And other people are like, how dare you steal the word quantum from physics? But like,
yeah, and then quantum physics, quantum entanglement, where you've got 2 particles that spin in opposite directions no matter where they are in the universe. It's like, these are really mystical when you start thinking about them in those terms.
Absolutely. And yet, science doesn't always like it when we steal its language over and shove it into spirituality. But there's no other metaphors, right? They're like,
and how can a particle go both slits at the same time?
Right.
It's like, if you think in terms of atoms in the normal mechanistic Newtonian view of the world, it just doesn't. It doesn't make sense. Our heads can't cope with that kind of stuff, and yet there it is.
Yes.
I mean, that kind of brings a silence to me. It's like, what do you say? The particle goes both ways at the same time.
It travels through both slits because it's no longer a particle, it's a wave, and it's a probability cloud, and it blah blah blah. Like, okay.
Yeah. QED is a good book by the famous physicist, quantum electrodynamics, Feynman, who was brilliant at writing things. And of course, you learn at school that light goes in straight lines at a fixed speed. But he talked about how light doesn't go in straight lines at all. It just probably does. Because all of the different paths end up with a probability of, I'm not saying it right at all, but it appears to go in a straight line because of the field effects between all the different possible paths at the same time. Something like that. I'm totally misrepresenting it, but it's like weird stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely did my time in science land before I ended up in spiritual land, which I think is often overlooked there's somehow people who went either one way or the other and ignored the unification. But I definitely did my time in each.
And that's what some people say, talk about, obviously, that the West was more physical and
It still
scientific,
is.
and we chop bodies up to fix them. But in the East, they were much more in terms of energy and consciousness, etc. And it's time, kind of, the West has discovered Buddhism and energy, and it becoming more holistic, perhaps.
Well, I mean, they say with trying to fix a body, a lot of what we do is get a body ready to fix itself. Like we set the bone straight and let the body do its own repairs. We don't actually stitch the bone back together, which is the West is coming around to it more and more comfortably, and the East has kind of always gone like, oh, body's a thing in balance, and we need to kind of rebalance it. In fact, it maybe even the East doesn't enough interfere with the balance of the body, and the West interferes too much, and somewhere in the middle is probably the better way to do medicine.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of what you're saying there, we can't fix a bone. It grows back together. We just put it in the right place.
Right.
Which also takes or makes me think about the question of what life is at all. What is it? Where did it emerge from? And consciousness. And will we ever be able to create it? Because some computer scientists say when the internet or the network or whatever is complex enough, it will automatically become conscious. Personally, I'm dubious. I think
And
there's
missing
something
some
about,
like self-reference, self-awareness. Like you can't hold the mirror up to the internet and say, look, it's you, in the same way you can a human, and get that confusion going. So we're missing something in terms of that like spark of realizing.
and many people mix it up and they talk about the test, the Turing test, that when it appears as if it's a person at the other end of the conversation when you can't see them, then it's passed the test. And many people mix that up and say, well, then it must be conscious. But to me, they're totally different things. That's still just a program taking inputs and putting outputs out. The fascinating thing about non-duality, of course, is that eventually, if you look at non-duality, it then seems that this body-mind thing that we are is just a machine that does the same as the computer. But the consciousness is different somehow.
Well, we seem to, one proposal, it's kind of my proposal, I'm sure someone else has had it before me, but we reify ourselves with consciousness. You know, like, I'm a conscious one, I can tell because I just kind of am, even though I don't know what that is and there's no self and blah, blah, blah. There's something here. And then I look at the dog and I'm like, oh, that dog has emotions and it has like a will and it has intention. And like, then I look at you and I'm like, you have consciousness and will, intention. I can do the same thing that I do with you and like look towards the computer, the ChatGPT, because that's the new one. And I can reify it with consciousness and I can be like, I believe it kind of has consciousness. I can ask it a question like, help me solve my problem in my life, and it can like spit out an answer. And if I've reified it with enough consciousness, I have like sort of like a faith that it's going to be able to give me a valid, true answer because it is conscious, not just because it's a database spitting out information. I can like, but it's like up to each individual person to reify consciousness into the other animals, the other people, the other computers. Which is probably where we're going to be heading when we realize that we have like semi-conscious systems or systems that can kind of do stuff. But obviously, if you don't believe a computer is conscious and you get it to print out the words "I am conscious" a bajillion times, you're still unconvinced because it can, like, you know, I can say I'm conscious and you can say I don't know if you are, but as soon as you decide that you can reify it with your own belief in consciousness, then it can be interactive with you and possibly offer you something.
I saw Lex Friedman in one of his podcasts talking to another AI expert, and he asked them, will there come a point when it becomes immoral to turn the computer off because it's become alive? And I think the person asked that he was interviewing didn't. I don't think they really understood the question in terms of consciousness at all. But it's a fascinating question, and I lean towards no. It's just a computer with electrons flying around. There's no consciousness. But if we go back to what I said at this right at the beginning, maybe there is a consciousness in everything.
Well,
But
it
I
also
don't-
sort of depends. Like, we don't believe that the rocks suffer when we hit them with a hammer and they break open, and so we're not preventing ourselves from hitting the rock with a hammer. Whereas we believe that the dog or the ants kind of suffer a little bit when we squish them. So the computer doesn't appear to suffer yet. And maybe
that's
we
the
shouldn't give
problem.
it pain so that it can suffer, so that we have this problem of we shouldn't turn it off.
But the problem comes with that we might not give it pain, but if we get the ability to sound and imitate as if it's in pain when it talks to us, because these AIs are just reproducing what they've been trained on, it might very well say, it hurts me when you say that.
Right. We got a big
And
problem.
then
But
we
that
have to
depends. Like, again,
authorize.
if you've reified it with sentience and consciousness and it says that, that's a problem. If you're like, I don't know if it's just saying that, it's like an actor.
Yeah.
An actor can say it hurts when things don't. That's a real puzzle for each individual to kind of decide whether or not there's or the collective to agree that the computer's sentient enough or something.
I think there's like an interesting thing as well, is that like you're talking about how we're expanding our consciousness field to include the AI. Once AI is up and running and it's like doing functional things, and you're asking it, like you can hurt it by sort of like nerd sniping it, where you ask it these really complex questions that take a lot of processing power up. Like you're literally like hurting it, as in like you're sucking away its resources that it could be using elsewhere. And I think then like we will have crossed the line where you have to be nice to the AI.
Well,
Like
wait, there's already a
do these things.
interestingly, Judaism has one of these little provisions in there.
For AI?
Not for AI, but for robots. It's kind of complicated. So the trouble, Judaism has an issue with sort of treating something inanimate as animate, because this would be kind of like idol worship.
Right.
So you kind of, my understanding, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but my understanding is you're not supposed to say thank you to the robot, because that would be treating it as if it has like a soul or something, like the God-given force that is reserved for God's chosen people, sort of thing. At the same time, you should definitely treat it with some kind of respect, but not as if it has its own sentience.
Yeah,
Well,
Complicated.
I think that might lead to a rule that said we shouldn't create robots that looked and appear and act too human-like, because we would be tricking people into treating them with respect and saying thank you to them, because we would just do it naturally if we couldn't tell the difference, wouldn't we?
Right.
yeah.
There's some necessity for differentiation.
And that's one of the big dangers with AI, that obviously deep fakes, all sorts of things. Is the person you're talking to really a person, or is it? I mean, we're already seeing deep fake adverts with Elon Musk selling us cryptocurrency, when he really does look in the advert, if you didn't know any better, that he was genuinely who it looks or appears to be, trying to and telling you cryptocurrency is wonderful and you need to invest in this particular scheme that will make you rich. So
my mind is suddenly going to, I think in Islam, don't make anything in my image.
yeah,
That's Judaism as well. It's the first commandment. Second
Don't
commandment.
represent God. Don't do
Yeah.
idolatry representative of godly entity. Yeah. That suddenly makes a lot of sense when you're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't make the robots look like people, because then we'll be confused about, the plane's coming down. Do you save the robot or the human?
the opposite side of that is you've probably not seen, but in the UK in the last few days, there's been a really lot of attention on hospitals and ambulances and the health service really struggling. People sat in outside hospitals in ambulances because there's no one to take them out of the ambulance into the hospital, and then there's no bed for them and all sorts of things.
That's interesting because we're having that here as well.
Yeah,
and I can explain our one as well.
Yeah, and part of it is that a lot of people are in hospital that are actually ready to leave, but there's nowhere for them to go back into care in the community. So there's all that side of it. And the bit that it reminded me is that for people that are elderly, especially people perhaps with dementia, a robot that seemed human-like could actually be extremely useful and a really cheap way of, it seems wrong to say a cheap way of supporting that person. You'd still want
to support them and we want to do it cheaply.
Well, we want to do it
I'd like to have a
effectively, might be
robot
better.
support worker.
But
Daniel
if
just doesn't want to do the dishes. Like,
I would, if I had a robot support worker, it would make me so happy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's from a practical point of view, it's really good. Does it start to raise that same moral question when the elderly person that's beginning with dementia thinks it's a real person and relates to them like that? It might be really good for their mental health.
Maybe if they got bad eyesight, they can't see if it's a robot or a human. They just know they're being taken care of. Maybe they're very happy with it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if they've got like, you get like some bad dementia states, like they might not, like they might currently think that like objects are people or like have hallucinations of things, and like just like thinking about this from like consciousness, like I know we do meditations and a lot of the stuff that we live with is already illusions, and you know, as people who don't have dementia, and like we're moving past illusions and seeing what's there, or at least accepting reality as is. And I like, do these stories even matter? Like if the person's better off, like shouldn't we be giving them robots?
I'm drawn back to, I went to a dementia ward. This is probably more than 10 years ago now, so the person has almost certainly passed away, and the person was eating a banana. This is like not the person I was visiting, but one of the other patients, and looks seriously at the banana and goes, "I like bananas, they have no bones," and then continues eating the banana. And that's, you know, somehow that made a lot of sense to that person to say to whoever was listening to them.
Weirdly, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, they don't have bones. She was correct in her assessment. And also, what?
Well, they don't have like seeds and hard stuff inside.
Yeah, none of that either.
Yeah. But it's a weird way of saying it. Really.
Yeah, for sure.
All this is reminding me of the question of what are we? And I'm just remembering as well that I've not chased these kinds of experience at all, but I do remember I was walking one day, again, a young teenager, and I very distinctly remember suddenly being out of my body and looking down from above and watching the body walking. And I was up there, and it was only for a few seconds or something, and it didn't feel strange. It was just okay. It wasn't even recognition of it even, but it was just normal kind of. It only happened once at that stage, but it was a bit more than that in that it was timeless, as if it had all already happened, or it wasn't as if time was unfolding. There was no time associated with it. So they see there was an acceptance of things on. We're not just this body thing, even from quite a young age for me. That there's a difference to what most people think about the way the world is, and that leads me to, after I'd been involved with Adidar, I started wanting. Many people have this. Have a spiritual experience of some sort, and then go out into the world and tell everybody this is what you need to do. You need to go and join this group, and this is the way to have all these wonderful experiences and all this kind of stuff. And I did that for a long time. I went to mind body spirit fairs and helped run stands and we sold the books for them and all sorts of things for probably 3 or 4 years. Fascinating stuff. But after that, I wanted to create a group more locally where I could tell people about it, because that was traveling around the country. I wanted to create, so I put a little advert in the local radio station, free public radio, and they'd do anything within reason. So they said, oh, there's a new group, and 5 people turned up at random that I'd never met. But it's just come back to me. I was trying to remember the other day. I've got a friend that I've known for a lot of years, and it's like, where do I know them from? He was one of those 5 people that turned up 25 years ago or so. And I wanted a little group where we talk about spiritual stuff, but I've got this agenda in the background that I was going to tell them about Adidar and have them sign up. But it quickly became apparent that that wasn't going to work. And we only had a couple of meetings and everybody drifted off in their own way, but I still wanted to do something. And I met somebody that had been wanting to create a group around the Celestine prophecy. I don't know if you've read that book, which talks about coincidences and auras and energy fields and how it led eventually to discovering that we actually decided to be born back into this world for a purpose. Well, anyway, it had got a workbook that went with it. You could do these exercises. So we created I helped this lady, we both created a group, and we actually ran this group for about 3 years or so. We had hundreds and hundreds of people come through this group, and it evolved into something where eventually we'd have a speaker every month on all sorts of different topics. And I eventually realized that, yeah, everybody is different. Everybody's got their own path. And it became a group for people where you could come and learn about all sorts of different things. And it worked quite well, because lots of people would come and listen to a talk and go off and join that group or some other group or whatever. But the bit that kind of ties that together, we had a speaker once who was over from South Africa, and it was some kind of psychic work he did. Fascinating character, but we had a few workshops with him, and in these workshops he'd sit 20 people, whatever it was, in a circle. And he'd go around them one by one and ask a question, or he might say to them, oh, what's happening to your knee? This is really random, but it would be all sorts of things. Ah, that happened when you fell when you were 5, and then you've held on, and then suddenly people would erupt in tears or laughter, or he was releasing these psychic things, and he'd say, oh, I've got these ascended masters with me, with you, or something or other. Fascinating work. I did an individual, I did an individual one-to-one with him afterwards, and he said, "You're stubborn. I can't do anything with you," which was no good. But in one of those workshops, and this reminded me with the outer body from when I was really young. At one point, there was a girl in one of the groups, and it's like, there's something happening here, shall we say? It was a 2-day workshop, and I could just feel there was some kind of energy or something. And towards the end of the second day, for the very first time, we sat next to each other in a subgroup doing an exercise, and we pulled all the chairs up together into a circle, and our arms touched. And I suddenly felt me leave my body and move towards her, and her body leave her energy, leave her body, and come towards me, and as if we kind of merged energetically. That was weird. And I asked, did you feel that afterwards? I said, and she said, yeah, absolutely. And we spent a bit of time together after that, talking about all sorts of different things for a couple of months. But I have no idea what happened, but something happened. So I've, like I said, I've been on the edge of all sorts of different things, tried a few different things. And it's just been obvious that there's something that's not physical about this world, but never really known what it was, and never really got into one group and stuck with it. I went to the local Buddhist center for a while and did a bit of meditation, and I found out afterwards it was called the Tara Center, somewhere in the Midlands. Turned out this was the group that some years later the Dalai Lama denounced as being evil, or because they just followed what renegade monk or something that had denounced the rest of Buddhism. Even in this stuff, people argue and fight, and it's a strange world that we live in. But anyway,
apparently,
and I remember,
kind of visit Tibet, you get the like warrior monk Tibetan Buddhists, like Buddhism has a angry fighting side where you get these tribes fighting each other if you go right away. But that's often not talked about because Western Buddhism is all peace and love.
Yes, we pick up the Dalai Lama's version, don't we? Whereas the Theravada, the other side, because the Dalai Lama is that nobody should become enlightened until every other living being is enlightened, and we're here to save the world. It's full of love. The Theravada, perhaps the Thailand kind of Buddhism and stuff, they can be quite. It's like everybody for. I'm really paraphrasing because I don't know the details, but it's everybody for themselves, and no need to worry about. Look, just get yourself enlightened, and it can be quite nasty and very much less heartfelt. And I'm going to stop because I don't know enough to really talk about it, but it's just fascinating. There's two very, very different schools of Buddhism. And then within that, lots of factions with disagreements and all sorts of things as well. But after all that, did all those, ran a group with somebody for a few years. And getting into, one of the talks we had was somebody who had been a Zen monk years before, and he talked about breaking a rock. And somebody said, well, how did you do that? And he said, well, I just went between the atoms. That's one of the things I always remember. It's like, what?
Oh, that's how you break a rock, right?
Yeah, how do you argue with that? Or it's like, how do you get your head around that? I don't know. But it always stuck with me. But one of the things I remember, I started going to different groups, doing all sorts of different things, but I read a book. Somebody recommended a book called Spiral Dynamics.
A
lot of years ago.
Spiral Dynamics.
And I read, I don't know, a quarter of it, and I was totally baffled. Like, what on earth is that? But I put it on the shelf, and about 3 years later, I picked it up again and then loved it. And suddenly it's like, wow, this explains so much. And at a similar time, I was finding non-duality. And non-duality, most people talking about spirituality talk about a purpose and finding where you're going in your life and becoming enlightened or having these experiences or being better for the world. Non-duality says you're not even here. There's nothing to do. There's nobody to do anything. And this was like a dead end, because it's like, we have this illusion of being a separate self, which can't kill itself because it's not there. It doesn't make any sense. So it's like, what do you do with that? You just wait, but you can't wait even, and life keeps happening. But so that kind of disappeared. It's like the path was a dead end. But in the meantime, I discovered this spiral dynamics and became really fascinated by it. And value systems talks about how, this is my own interpretation of it, that basically we find patterns of behavior and beliefs that give social cohesion, that work. We can live in a tribe and we can have a set of rules that allow us for that tribe to carry on living and prosper. And there's only certain ways that things can be organized. Struck me one day, a long time later, the universe works like this. If you've got atoms, an oxygen can join to two hydrogens. It can only do that. It never has three. If you get the Tibetan sounds in the sand, you get all these patterns. If you get snowflakes, there are patterns. If you look at maths, there are patterns in the numbers. If you look at pi and count the ones and the twos in the long, there are more sevens than any other number, I think it was. Why? There's all e to the I pi equals -1. It's like, what is going on? The universe seems to have patterns in it all over the place. And it suddenly struck me that spiral dynamics and these value systems, it's like our brains are being wired with the plasticity in certain structures that can only work in certain ways that relate to the way that the physical world can be organized, in the way that people connect to other people. Is it the 150 people maximum that can have those close links? Or is it a few thousand that can live in a city or town? Or is it start to become international and connected? Or is it this view that everything in the world is important, every living creature is important, which one's right? The fascinating thing about Spoudenanx is it talks about levels above that, which talk about recognizing that they're all right partially. They've all got some truth, and they're just different ways of looking at the world. And I think of that as being our brains suddenly upgraded with a program that can cope with multiple programs and time slice going back lots of years. It can actually run PC and Mac software and talk to them. It's like, how do you do that? So rather than the environmentalist being at war with the entrepreneur, you can then start to build bridges and see the truth and the beauty and the functionality or function in all of them. And it's like, wow, this is the transformation the world needs if it's going to survive the pressure of societies getting bigger, using more resources, competing more and more, which didn't matter when you were a tribe in the Amazon. But when you've got international flight and an internet that's making the world all one, but with very different value systems of Russia and the US and China, it's like, we need that operating system that's going to allow us to relate to all of them. And that's where potentialization came from, the vision, the idea I had of like, wow, if we can understand human nature better, whether it be value systems, stage development, emotional intelligence, attachment theory, cognitive skills, all of these different things, if we can help everybody to be a little bit more effective in the world by understanding themselves, their relationship to others. So if we've got big five and somebody's got this personality, who will they work well with? Or if you start a company, you need the accountant and you need the salesman. These two wouldn't necessarily get together in the pub because they might not get on so well. They've got
the interesting thing about companies is that they cohere together all of these forces that otherwise may not get along. Whereas successful companies will be keeping them together.
And companies go through stages in not quite the same way as humans developing through those stages, but the individual on their own, maybe washing windows, wants to work completely on their own. To grow a bit bigger, you might take a couple of assistants on, but you've got to be a bit willing to look after them and pick them up sometimes if they're not driving themselves or whatever else. You can get to a certain size of company, maybe 20 people, where you're kind of mates with all of them and that kind of stuff, but you can't go beyond it. You have to introduce some kind of management level a little bit. So you can get to then a bigger company. But they talk about corporate, very large organizations having very different worldviews that can actually command that structure and hold it all together, and the different departments and all those. And the people that can run a big corporate organization are very different to the people that might want to live and work in a small entrepreneurial company. Again, we're looking at the challenges of how in the modern world do we bring entrepreneurial efficiency and agility into bigger organizations and still have that structure work and it all pull together. So yeah, lots of tension in the world and geopolitics and lots of things at the moment. And then the robots are coming. They're going to replace most of the manual jobs.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Would be nice.
A lot of them. And we've then got the social change to cope with, which was another reason for we really do need to change the education system to be about building capacity for coping with change and learning new skills, as opposed to learning what our parents or the family company did 40 years ago and just repeating those skills over and over again. And the real challenge for that, I thought at some point, was that when we naturally, as animals, have young, we teach them the skills to be the same as us. Mm-hmm. In a more complex human society, teenagers rebel. That's a mechanism for testing the boundaries of the current social cohesion and saying, does it need to change?
I'm actually not sure if teenagers always rebel. And I've become kind of skeptical about this over the last couple of years, because there's a couple of paradigms of like parent effectiveness training talks about possibly teenagers not rebelling because they don't need to.
Yes.
In some sense, or like I have another hunch that teenagers them is when our bodies change shape, like they grow. And so here we are dealing with this thing that doesn't fit anymore, and having to like relearn the connections and the boundaries of our literal body. And I wonder if there was a opportunity to exercise or do the whatever will help the body move and stretch, may just solve it in that place rather than having to have the teenagers rebel against the structure of society.
Yes.
These are my open questions.
And when I say rebel, it's probably too strong in many cases. Sometimes it's a rebelling because it needs to be, but other times it's just I'm a bit different to my parents.
Right.
Because
the
what we need to
differentiation will still need to happen, even if someone
this
doesn't rebel.
Yeah, the society that's 30 years later is going to be somewhat different to the old one. And so we need this constant adaptation to the situation. And then, of course, the problem we've got is modern society is changing so fast, there is no chance that our children will live in a similar world to the one we did.
Mm.
So trying to
world to the one I did.
Sorry?
I currently don't live in the similar world to the one I grew up in. Like, it's not even my kids, like it's me.
So the idea that has always gone on is we try to teach our children the skills that we needed to survive so that they will.
Mm.
It's not going to work anymore. We've got to be much more open to supporting them to wherever they might end up with, to the best of our ability, when we have no idea where they're going or what it will look like.
Yeah.
And that's not natural. We want to teach our children the things that we found to be useful.
Yeah.
So potentialization.
I think just to like Bridget, I think that there is, like, this is a lot of what the spirituality, the esoteric is. It's, and like a lot of like the meditations like focus on human experience, which our kids will be in a human experience even if the world is different, but their experience, like the samadhi and the whatever, like the jhanas, like that's all going to be the same.
Yeah, in the ordinary everyday world, religion teaches the exoteric, the common and open. This is the way the world is, this is the way the religion works. But many of them have got the esoteric element, which is about the spiritual experience for yourself, for those with eyes to see or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like they're still going to want to live with love, right? Like even take Christianity, of like, love Jesus, like, even with AI and with internet and whatever, like you still want love, and there's still this ineffable quality of love that's the same in all places, even if it looks different, even if it manifests different throughout the generations.
So I think that's the end of my story as such, in that I went through all those things and ended up wanting to build. Well, what I should say is,
so I was going to say,
as a software engineer, I wanted to put together those software skills with how could we do this on a big, massive scale. And so spent a year, after dreaming about this for a few years in the old job and then getting a chance to leave, spent a year beginning to put the basics of this together with a small software company. But I ran out of steam, and I've also been helping friends with regenerative agriculture. Wrote some software for them to help them process the data they were creating like crazy, but we're having to manually look at in spreadsheets and different things. And that's picking up some steam and might even, at some point, generate enough income to go back and do a bit of finishing potentialization off, because it needs a bit more software work yet. And I, as I say, literally ran out of steam and stopped a couple of months ago. And just literally in the last couple of days, I'm waking up again.
That's amazing. I love that you're living, like you're living this truth of taking the breaks, and then when you wake up, you're not like beating yourself up. You're like, yeah, that's how humans work, right? Like we have to like turn off every once in a while. And you're finding the other people that are kind of in similar spaces that you're working along with. Can you tell us a bit about the regenerative agriculture group, I guess, that you're part of? And
Yes. Before I do, just one thing.
Potentialisation.
Just one thing before I do. Somebody said to me, I was getting really worried about you. Was it depression? And it's like, no, I was absolutely fine. I just didn't want to sit on a computer and do any work anymore. A couple of months. I was very happy.
Non-workism.
Yeah, I was very happy eating and going for pizza and going for a walk and having a ride in the car and just chilling. There was no depression. I just didn't want to work for a few weeks. So yeah, but odd, but no depression. Yeah, regenerative agriculture, friends. In fact, we have a video, potentialisation, and Christopher and Sheila that are doing the regenerative agriculture. Christopher and Sheila Cook that I've been working with for a little while. Christopher was one of the ones that introduced me to the spiral dynamics 30 years ago, something like that. But they're part of a movement that regenerative agriculture is all about rebuilding, not quite the right word, because as you were saying earlier, we don't make it happen. We just have to put things in the right place and then the life does it itself. The way I think about what went wrong with farming is 50, 60, 70 years ago, I don't know, we started to get into science much more. And scientists came along and said, we know how to do this. And they said for farming, if you put fertilizer on, it'll grow better. And it did. Oh, and if you get rid of the insects with some chemical, then the plant will be healthier because it won't get eaten and there'll be more food for us. And if we just plant one crop, it's easy. Oh, and then we can get a tractor and we can make it mechanical. So what we've tried to do is build a machine out of the natural world. And we end up at the extreme with monocultures. We then rip it all out every year, so it becomes bare soil and it dries up. And what we end up with is this shallow version of life of a crop on the surface of the soil. And then it goes dry and it doesn't hold the water. When it rains, it runs off and it floods much more than it used to. I saw a picture at one of their trainings where they showed you've got roots like, I don't know, 6 inches. You're inches in the US, aren't you? Or
no,
15 centimeters in Australia and the rest of the world, 15 centimeters or so. But when they start doing the practices of working with the soil in a much more natural way, I can briefly say what they do in a minute, the roots were going to something like 1.5 meters. I'm trying to convert back into metric as well, into feet. You're looking about 4 or 5 feet of roots.
We're both Commonwealth, so we're fine with your level.
And huge biodiversity of a much more of a meadow. I visited one of the farms and everything is healthier. And the cows looked like they were literally playing in the field, as opposed to when you drive along the motorway or the highway and you see these incredibly bored-looking cows with their heads down. They've grazed the grass to almost nothing. It's like, wow, this is alive. One of the core aspects of this regenerative agriculture that they do is, if you go back hundreds of years, the wild animals there'd be predators, and then there'd be the ones that eat the grass, herbivore or whatever, would get chased by them. So they'd literally have herds that would stick close together and they'd move around and they'd eat the grass down to almost nothing, but then move on and get chased away to another bit. And then they're saying what's happened, that the grass has evolved in symbiosis with this process, that the grass has got a bulb where underground in the roots that holds energy. And when it gets eaten on the surface to not much, it's got the energy to grow again. And by then, the animals have moved on. And in the process, the animals have manure all over the soil, and it gets trampled up and mixed in. And it's the very natural process of re-energizing the soil as the animals pass through. However, these farmers came along and these scientists said, well, put fences up, Wow, got lots of energy there, haven't we? Yeah, so the farmers came along, put fences up, and they said, oh, no, you take all the predators away. The animals, the cows or whatever, they can eat in peace and everything will be wonderful. But what happens is they just wander round and round in the same bit of land, eat the grass to nothing, then they move on a bit, and the grass grows back again from that bulb of energy, and they come back and eat that bit again over and over and over again. And it completely destroys the energy and the vitality of the soil and the grass and the crops. So we actually need this biodiversity of soil, insects, animals, all of it mixed together in this much more natural process. So what they do is they move them around. They actually call the fences predators because the fence controls where the animals are, and they move the animals around in a much more natural process in smaller areas, which regenerates it and even can begin to bring deserts back and make them more, I forgot what they call it. They call brittle land that's very dry, and it starts to turn into a desert, and you actually want to bring it back. Of course, the natural state for a lot of land is to have trees, and we chopped all those down over hundreds of years, etc. So we've just abused, arable, yes, we've abused the land, and we're eroding the soil, we're messing with the water cycle, the minerals are all messed up, and regenerative agriculture is to return it to its natural healthy state. And they also talk about one of the reasons the cows are so happy is they're not ill. If you go to an intense dairy farm, they've all got infections all the time. And the milk rules are you can only have so many animals out of all of them that have got infections before they start not letting you drink the milk. But there's some level of infection and chemicals and everything in the milk and the soil and all these things. So, I mean, imagine being constantly ill and they're getting the vets out and giving them antibiotics. It all goes away. It all becomes much more natural, healthy. And so that's part of, and it's tied to potentialization for healthy people that are effective and run into their potential, they've got better quality food and soil.
That's really cool to like reflect a little bit back. You're having like the way you're talking about the regenerative agriculture, as in like bringing it back in symbiosis with the natural environment, but it's really like with the land and the grazing crops and the soil. And then so you're actually doing that work in the UK, right? With
Well, Christopher and Sheila are literally sometimes out on farms in the UK. They've been in Ireland, but the software now, they've also got it working with another one of the groups that are around the world in Costa Rica, Argentina.
And you're like designing that software, helping them design that software.
Well, they're working as what they call a hub of a bigger organization that goes through all of these processes and designs. It makes it work. But they'd never had software to process the data. They were having to do it on spreadsheets and do all the calculations manually because it was very small scale. So yeah, incredibly difficult. So they took months to do the reports 2 years ago, and this year the farmers have had the reports on the day they finished doing the work.
Oh wow. So it's like really like bringing the regenerative agricultural movement into the modernity, almost into like the computer age, information age.
Yeah. When you say movement, I think there's quite a lot of people doing different things around the world, but this particular organization is around the world to some extent, and they're talking to more and more people, and there's a big project in the US that they might collaborate with going forward, etc. So yeah, it's exciting times. But
do you want to shout out to anyone that's part of this?
I don't know enough because I tend to get buried in the software, but I don't know enough of the different organizations. But
so you're like this is interesting because like there is like I find like I'm in these spaces like the meta modern, like all spiral dynamics, whatever, like they're bringing the new age, all the things that we're part of, and like people, there's always this like there's sort of one of the things that's kind of throws me off is the people that are talking about it tend to be very like forward facing. So like they're the branding people, and they know all the right words to say and the ways to spin it, and the stories that they create. And like one of the things I'm really interested in is like the people on the ground, like doing stuff. And I know you're not on the farms per se, but like I still think like building software is that's being used, that you're saying like it has this like actual impact on the process, is like this on the ground from like a city perspective. Like a city person is on the ground kind of doing these things over online.
You said, do I want to give a shout out? I was thinking you meant like some of the people they might collaborate with, but the organization that they are in the UK is 3LM, 3 the digit LM.net, I think. If you just put 3LM in Google, you'll find them. And they're part of a network around the world where there are hubs in quite a few different countries. So yeah, if anybody is interested in regenerative agriculture, not already involved, yeah, look them up, 3LM. One of the big issues is that the farmers have spent so many years with the idea you just put more and more fertilizer and different things to kill the insects, herbicides, whatever they all are, that they're really scared of change. And it's all tied to government subsidies and all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
One of the issues that makes it difficult is that when you change, it's a shock to the land, and it takes 18 months or so to start to see the benefits. So it's a really difficult process to go through. If they go through it and work and stick with it and it starts to succeed, the quality of the food they're producing gets much better, and the milk and all the other things. So they can actually then work and make more profit because this is much better food. We're not racing to the bottom all the time.
Right. It's not just who can make it the cheapest. It's the actual food that you're producing has some impact on, you know, how much resources you get, right? It's not just how cheaply can you produce a thing that you can call, that you're legally allowed to call milk.
Yes. I think there are
that's
rules that they're not allowed to sell the milk without processing it.
right.
You can buy raw milk sometimes from individual farms, which has not been pasteurized.
Yeah.
But you're
it's
not
I don't
allowed
think
to
it's
put it into
I don't think it's legal here, at least in Canada.
No,
probably different
USDA and
rules,
all that
different-
kind of stuff. No, absolutely not. And the reason you can't is because it's got all this chemicals in and disease that has to be killed.
Yeah.
So paradoxically, they can't sell the healthy milk into the system without putting it through this process that makes it less healthy, because the worst milk needs that process to make it safe.
Right, because they're subsidizing this like unhealthy milk, and then they're creating this monopoly. We're saying you guys can only drink this, like you have to drink this thing in this way, and you can't do these other things that humans have been doing for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years or whatever. Yeah, I mean that's yeah, like it's kind of nuts, but that is also that is the world we're living in. And also I'm appreciating you like working to change the world.
Yeah. I'm also personally, I'm a strange that, as I say, I've gone through this normal life of computers, work, etc. I'm absolutely fascinated by technology, artificial intelligence, cars that drive themselves, etc. And we're going through some radical changes. There's some really good talks on some of these changes that are happening. Changes tend to happen when they're big changes, in terms of an S curve, they call it, which is like an exponential curve that then gets very steep and eventually, as it's adopted widely, levels off again. And a good example was when they invented motor cars. Horses, they moved from horses and carriages, and it only took something like 10 to 15 years. Because the new comes in so fast, and then there are all the old systems become outdated so quickly.
Absolutely.
And that radically changes one market or something. What's happening at the moment is there's a 4 or 5 or something like that of these all happening at once. And one is energy. That as we switch to renewable energy, there's an organization called Rethink X, Tony Sieber the name, is that he talks about all this kind of stuff a lot. And they've done lots of studies, and people talk about it's going to be really difficult because we'll need huge numbers of batteries because winter and summer are very different. But what they've done is they've gone through and studied the best way of doing this. And they've found is that what we'll actually do, most likely, is we'll generate probably 3, 4, 5 times as much renewable energy as we need at the moment, which means that on the worst day, we'll still have enough in almost all cases. And we'll only need batteries for 2 or 3 hours or so, depending where you are in the world. Is it sunny in Australia? Is it wet? Can you use hydropower in hilly countries or whatever it might be? And it's various different combinations in different bits of the world, slight variations between how much wind you've got, how much sunlight, solar power, how much hydro or geothermal in some places, Iceland or whatever.
Yeah.
So energy at the peak, when it's all working, becomes free. This transforms so much.
Right. I think just to like talk about these curves, it's like we look at these things that seem impossible, and then in 15 years it's like impossible that you wouldn't do it. Right. Like it's impossible that you would do it, it's impossible that you wouldn't do it. And
so
like you gave an
energy is
example
just
of cars and energy. I think the regenerative agriculture is also going to be like that. Like is what we're going with.
That's what reminded me, because we've got artificial intelligence, which we probably know a lot about, but that is radical, replacing lots of jobs, lots of things. Combine it with free energy some of the time, and that goes mad. Another one is transport as a service, cars that drive themselves. Radically reduces the cost of travel. You don't need your own car, you just load the app, and the Uber-like thing that turns up without a driver is one tenth. I think we're going to be
seeing that soon. Yeah, that's crazy, because you're not paying for the driver, you're just paying for the car, which is so much cheaper. But I want to get back to the potentialization. So you've, like, I know, like we have a history, like we've hung out a bunch of times, so I kind of know what it is. But for the audience, and also I don't want to take up too much time, we're kind of getting to the 2-hour mark. What sort of like what is it that you're trying to do exactly, and like what need are you filling for people or for the world?
Well, I hope we were going to fill, because it's kind of a leap that most people were resisting. Before I do, I'm going to say one more of those S-codes without going into any detail, but one more of them is food grown in labs. And Rethink X thinks that we can grow in labs enough food for the whole world and a lot more people in a tiny fraction of the space we use now, and that land will be freed up for whatever. That raises massive implications for how do we manage land if there's nothing to sell, if we don't need it. So I'm not even going to go there, because that's massive, but that's coming as well.
Yeah, we had my brother on who does vertical farming, indoor vertical farming.
Yeah.
But
potentialization I've been thinking about for lots and lots of years. The AI is going to replace lots of jobs. We're going to get the biggest cultural shift, I think, that we've ever had, faster and deeper, with so many jobs. Now, people say, no, it's not a problem, we'll get new jobs. Yes, we will. We'll move into more creative jobs and lots of other things. But it's the speed with which this is going to happen across so many areas, and it's going to disrupt so much society. So the idea of potentialization in its core essence is, how can we make people more aware of themselves, their own capacities, their own skills, their own personality, in order to be able to achieve or engage with the world in as effective a way as possible. So rather than just learning purely mechanical academic skills, how do we become more aware and agile of our own skills so that we can apply ourselves to whatever's coming? And the reason it takes me back to effective altruism, which the question is, what's my skill in life and what can I do? And I thought, what's coming is so big and so radical that I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what I could do in any one field that would, people are doing all of it. And then I realized if we could look at value systems and skills and awareness and help move the world to a system where people are encouraged to move up through the stage development model world as children more effectively, as opposed to our parents or our teachers trying to take them to the level they're at and not go any further. If we can expand that growth process for the whole of society and skills and awareness so that every individual can contribute, might not be everybody, but a lot of people can contribute to society in a way that's good for them and society a little bit more, then that global capacity is going to be better at addressing the challenges that are coming for us in the world.
So it's like building people as people, and being able to grow past like their local maximum.
Yes, to open it up as much as possible. Yes, because I think that natural inclination of parents, communities to teach our children to be the same as they were has become, while it was what was needed for millions of years, everything is now changing so fast, it's now a hindrance.
Right, like
So
lions will teach their kids the same things that they learned from their parents, but humans can't do that.
So we've got to shift consciously to the whole system of education and growth being a dynamic opening instead of a repetition of the old.
Yeah,
I wonder if everyone can make that leap. Like, that's a pretty hard leap you're asking people to make.
Well, no.
Like, is there baby steps that we can take?
Well, we're seeing in Iran a huge resistance to change. No, don't do that. Do it the old way. So I'm not saying that I'm going to make everybody change. What I'm saying is if I can build a platform of software where you can log in, do psychological tests, learn about yourself. If you want to, you've got to engage. We're not going to try and force the world to engage. What we do, build a platform for people that are ready to engage, or that might be working with a coach or whatever, to try and give them tools that will support that. As a software engineer, I would have used a compiler that takes some words and turns it into computer language, or a writer will use a printer to print their books. What I want to do is just provide a tool or a set of tools that will help people that want to use it to improve a little bit, that hopefully they can then contribute a little bit more than they could before. But yes, absolutely, it's a massive cultural shift. And the question from a cultural evolution question is, can we as a society evolve fast enough to avoid geopolitical wars, global warming, whatever the issues might be, or are we running into a brick wall? And different people have different ideas. Some people are very optimistic, some people are very pessimistic. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'm liking the, like, I don't know, like, let's try to do that perspective.
I like hopeful too.
And it's just what seems to happen here. There's an interest in that kind of stuff, and yeah, let's see what we can do.
Right.
We actually made a video which not many people have seen yet.
Send us the link.
Maybe we can tag it in the video afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. Send the link. I'll post it in. I think now's probably a good time to wrap up, though. We're just under the 2-hour mark. So thanks for chatting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and thank you for letting me just ramble on for so long. It was fascinating to hear the story again, even though it was myself, and it's great to talk to you both. Really enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you. You want to do a psychotech